I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Is there a secret geometric unification theory that explains how genetics actually works? Is there something going on that allows life to be formed out of this hidden vibrational template based on frequency? And what if the actual father of this theory is someone we haven't even met yet, coming out of Russia, having published papers all the way back since at least 1971? And is it possible that the 20 amino acids that build all of life were referred to in the Mayan counting system? These are some of the exciting questions we're going to tackle in this episode. This model of a geometric universe is a very compelling new idea for us, because what it fundamentally is doing is it's putting vibration back on the map. It's telling us that there is something about life that emanates from an invisible energy. This energy appears to be synonymous with consciousness, and therefore lends to the idea that life itself is a projection of a universal mind. That mind could be, in fact, the mind we call God, or the Creator, or the universe, depending on your nomenclature. But the underlying concept is so fascinating because we have taken our geometric theory out of the realm of matter and atoms and force fields in space and around planets, and we've ported it right into biological life. So anyone who tries to say that biological life has only occurred on Earth would be sorely mistaken. The basic laws that govern quantum mechanics itself include geometric principles, and those same geometric principles apply to life. A few episodes back, I talked about a new study that just came out in December 2017 from UCLA, showing how they now think that biology is universal in nature, because they found microbes on Earth in a complex ecosystem all the way back almost at the very beginning of the foundation of liquid water. And that suggests that all of the heavy lifting that was done to make that life vastly predates the age of the Earth and is very likely universal. So if we see that the universe emanated from this single geometric form, as I've been saying in episode after episode here, geometry is the big secret to understanding the nature of the universe, because all of space and time is emanating from this one geometric form. And this is just a very brief reminder of stuff that you already know from watching this. All quantum fields emanating off of this seed, which if you put 4 corners on it, it becomes the Merkaba shape, which shows up in the distribution of gas and volcanoes on planets, shows up in molecules, atoms, and now we're seeing similar geometry in biological life. All of this geometry, as I've said again and again, comes from resonance. This is sand particles in water, otherwise would look milky, but once you vibrate it with sound, you get this beautiful geometric pattern. And very importantly, if you change the frequency, the geometry changes as well. These are literally structures. You could poke at them, they stay strong, and they don't go away. So if the universe is a geometric seed, not the Big Bang where nothing exploded and becomes something, that's the whole universe, now we have a model in which geometry is the underlying pattern, and clearly with what we see with Hans Jenny's work in this water droplet resonance, geometry is a function of vibration. So how amazing to find that those same geometric principles are now governing how proteins and life itself is forming. So in case you missed it, just so that we're really clear and you don't get lost, because this could be like walking in on a calculus class, the DNA double helix is stacked up so that it wraps over these dodecahedrons, which again are nothing but vibration. Don't think of them as physical objects, think of them as resonance patterns. That's the secret to DNA. That's what we've been missing. And we just got done talking about Dr. Glenn Ryan, who believes that in the nucleole area, in between nucleoles in the nucleus of the atom, that DNA is wrapping up into a toroidal shape. Now the really cool thing about the toroidal shape is that all of these resonant geometries I've been telling you about, the cube, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron, those are the 5 platonic solids, all of them fit perfectly inside a sphere. And when I mean perfectly, every point, every vertex of those shapes touches the edge of the sphere precisely. They don't poke out or in. Every line is the same length. Every face is the same shape. Every internal angle is the same angle measurement. So they're very symmetrical. And that symmetry is something that apparently the whole universe, including higher dimensions, is built on. Because once we get into that whole thing, that's another crazy area in which the most advanced models of the universe in multidimensionality are based on something that's called the E8 topology. This is by Garrett Lisi, the surfer dude who discovered the theory of everything. And E8 is just basically a very, very complex geometric shape, and depending on how you tilt it, you can get what appears to be all of the relationships that we see in quantum physics. So a lot of scientists are starting to agree with Lisi and think that, in fact, the universe has this geometric solution for higher dimensions. Well, we're not even talking about higher dimensions here. We're actually talking about life. If we have a unified field theory, it's going to work for dimensionality, it's going to work for matter, it's going to work for energy, it's going to work for space, time, and it's going to work for life. And all of this gets back again to the idea that we now have a way of showing that life is a basic part of the laws of the universe, because if that one seed fractalized out into all of the stars and all of the planets and all of the beings in the universe, then that seed is alive. That seed is conscious because you are alive and you are conscious. So it's a principle of equivalence. It's law of one in its simplest form. So once again, the really interesting thing here is that if you take these 4 basic nucleotides for messenger RNA, which is the fundamental form of DNA that they've been using in these studies, what we see here is that you have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil, and it's the combinations of those 4 that make your 20 basic amino acids that create protein. Now, the really stunning thing about this was what we saw from Dr. Mark White, who re-envisioned those 4 nucleotides as the 4 corners of a tetrahedron. Well, wait a minute, David. Didn't you just say that the tetrahedron was the original shape that the entire universe is made out of? Yes. Now, granted, you have to take 2 of them. You have to invert them and put one way and one the other way, but that's okay. The actual shape itself is built, the one that Nima Arkani-Hamed and Yaroslav Trinka talked about, it's built from 4 tetrahedrons. So now think about how crazy that is, right? The original seed of the universe, here we go, this is nuts, looks the same as the tetrahedron you can make with the 4 basic nucleotides that all of life that we ever see is made out of. And this model that I talked about in previous episodes is all about this little guy, this tetrahedron, shifting around in one of 120 different positions that it can have inside a dodecahedron. So again, don't get caught up in the shapes. Don't think of them as physical objects. Think of them as resonance patterns, vibrational patterns. How does that tetrahedron move around inside the dodec? It moves around by subtle vibrational changes. These are relationships between vibrations, and just like I showed you in previous episodes, that the protons inside the nucleus of an atom can have different layers, like shells. The genetic code has shells. There's a dodecahedral shell, and there's a tetrahedral shell inside, and depending upon what music you play, depending upon the note, determines how the tetrahedron moves. Isn't it interesting, the possibility that all biological life in the entire universe is made out of A, C, G, and U, and that's the 4 corners of the most basic tetrahedron that the whole universe is built from. The original seed that started it all. It is alive. The corners of the seed are the corners of the nucleotides that then shift around inside a dodec to make life. It becomes universal. Remember this diagram here where I showed you that there are 20 types of amino acids, and here's the name, and you can see how the A, C, G, and U fit together to make each of them? As I said before from Dr. Mark White, all of those relationships correspond, the 20 amino acids correspond to the 20 corners on a dodecahedron. Now, if you were to cut this out with cardboard and you could tape it all together or glue it together, you would get a nice dodecahedron, and all of your amino acids are there, as well as the A, C, G, and U in the middle, which again is a tetrahedron flipping around different ways inside. So just as another refresher, this is Dr. Mark White saying there is a suitable relationship between a dodec and a tetrahedron, and it is identical to relationship between nucleotides and amino acids. What are the odds? So there's your tetrahedron inside and the dodec on the outside. You can see how they fit together. And once again, very briefly, the 120 different positions of the tetrahedron that can fit inside the dodec, which is the master key to unlocking the mysteries of life. An entire language exists between these two basic structures even before a single molecule ever randomly tumbles by to take advantage of it. Now, I didn't get to this when I was talking about this before. This is new. Now, my question to you is this. This is Dr. Mark White talking. What are the odds, then, that sets of molecules would perfectly emulate this structural language, and yet there could be no logical relationship between the language of structures and the language of molecules? I would say those odds are so small as to be zero. In other words, there is logically no chance that the genetic code is not a structural language at the very bottom. And then this just shows you, I'm not going to really get too deep into this, but this shows you how heavy the scientific language can get as he talks about this. This diagram represents two different maps between sets. First, it demonstrates a map between the set of intersecting planes in a dodecahedron, that's the geometry, and the set of tetrahedral conformational isomers in a dodecahedron. And now conformation, of course, is how DNA shifts and winds and unwinds. And of course, the tetrahedron moving around inside the dodec gives the information for the different types of DNA and proteins that will form. That's the idea. Now, secondly, he says this also represents a map of the set of nucleotide triplet permutations. Uh-oh, it's getting heavy. Nucleotides are those four basic A, C, G, and U, and the set of standard amino acids. These maps are isomorphs, which means that they both are like each other, and they represent symmetry groups. What are the odds? He says these are not languages, but you can build a language organically from them. Do not get confused between a map and a language. A map of the Earth is no more the Earth than a codon table is the genetic code. So what he's saying here is that this system works, and it's the underlying nature of it, but you're not going to actually find the dodecahedron with the tetrahedron per se, unless you are able to look at the wave patterns, at the energy. That's when you're going to actually see this. But you're not going to see it as some kind of physical object. You would have to be able to find a way to actually measure resonance patterns and energy frequencies, which is possible that we could come up with breakthroughs that do that. But the important point is here, you don't need to actually see it with a photograph. The relationships precisely describe all of these mysterious things that nobody seems to have been able to understand. Remember, 1968 is when these scientists figured out how these 20 amino acids get along. And all 20 of them is all there is, and that's what the entirety of our genetic code is built from. So they didn't know why certain ones wanted to talk and other ones didn't. Now, up until I'd looked into this a little more and was on Dr. Mark White's website, I thought he was the first person to come up with a discovery that you can map out these 20 relationships on a geodesic. In this case, he uses the dodecahedron and the 20 corners of it. But it turns out that is not true. It seems very likely that before Dr. Mark White discovered this, a Russian scientist already had. And this is so amazingly cool. One of the things that I just, again, stumbled over when I went back to Mark White's website, because the daughter of this scientist saw what he was doing online and sent him a copy of the original paper in Russian, which he didn't translate at the time. Maybe 2007 didn't have really good tools for that, but now we do. Google Translate doesn't do that good of a job, but at least we got the title and the gist of what's going on, and there are also amazing diagrams. This Russian scientist figured out the same thing. And if two different people independently come up with it, and they go into a great deal of technical detail about it, that suggests that there's some greater whole that if you do the homework, you will find it. So let's take a look. The name of this Russian scientist who independently discovered the same thing as Dr. Mark White is Henry Volokonsky. And this picture of him is very interesting to me because it looks like he's a man out of time, doesn't it? He could be right out of the Renaissance, some kind of Renaissance alchemist. And it may very well be that in another lifetime, that's what he was. Now, what's so interesting about this man, and I'm going to show you some more pictures of him here. Look at this. He's got everything he needs. He's got the cigarette in one hand, the drink in the other. He is also, believe it or not, a famous playwright. And in his obituary, nobody even remembered him for discovering this interesting quirk about genetics. He is known, one of the things he's most known for is this play called The First Mushroom, a forestry comedy. And it becomes clear pretty quick as you look at this. This is a Russian webpage now. Look at that. There is this weird purple psychedelic mushroom sitting there at the front of the stage. And I don't think that's an accident. So look, in all seriousness, okay, if we go back to the work of Terence McKenna, he is one of the people that doesn't use the term psychedelic anymore. They call it entheogens. Now, entheogen means a chemical or a plant that allows you to see the Creator, to see God, right? Theology, right? Entheogen. So it does appear, and I'm not endorsing the use of psychedelics, but if you listen to guys like Terence McKenna, their theory is that people ingesting psychedelics get visionary states of consciousness where they psychically access information that wasn't already available to us. So it seems pretty clear that if Volokhonsky made a play called The First Mushroom and has a psychedelic purple mushroom with little white dots on it, which looks just like Amanita muscaria but with a different color, he probably has taken mushrooms himself. And then you'll also notice that the way that people are dressed up in this play, at least some of them, like the guy in the front there in the middle, definitely looks like he is supposed to represent God because he's got the big long beard and the long hair, and he's got this flowing, funny robe. And you see in the back there, the two men in the back also appear to be like discontent in some way. And so this is this funny play, and this actual website is advertising the play, people to go see it, where they're playing music and they're also reading notes. You can see there's two guitarists there. The guy at the top has a very interesting looking guitar. And there's probably that woman on the right, probably a vocalist and percussionist. So anyway, it just goes to show you that this guy was a musician. He wrote poetry. The poetry was adapted into this very interesting play about mushrooms in the forest. This is probably the musician doing some of the acting for the play. And this is Volokhonsky right before his death. Now, unfortunately, he did die on April 9th, 2017. And I'm going to read you a little bit about his obituary here because it never even mentions this amazing scientific discovery that he had. The poet Henry Volokhonsky, the author of the poem Paradise, above the blue sky is a golden city. Well, isn't that interesting? That sounds a lot to me like the idea of ascension. The golden age, the golden city above the sky. And now we're seeing that Volokhonsky almost certainly took mushrooms, some very powerful ones in the Russian forest. And that might have also been what gave him this strange insight into the real nature of the genetic code, as we're going to see in a minute here. But his poetry, he's an inspirational person, and he's seeing a vision of a new future with a golden, heaven-like paradise that we could go into. And that's the name of the poem. And people apparently really loved this poem. It's very popular in Russia. He died when he was 82 years old, in his sleep on Saturday, April the 8th. The obituary was on the 9th. And then a Russian rock musician, Boris Grebeneshchikov, said that Volokhonsky, through his creativity, will remain forever in the history of music. The man who wrote such a brilliant song should remain in the history of Russian music forever. But then he said, these were the best songs I've ever heard without anyone singing anything. So it doesn't literally mean that Volokhonsky wrote songs, although that Forest Mushroom play seems to have been his poetry adapted to music and song. So in a sense, he is a musician, he just wrote the lyrics. Other people probably wrote the chords and the melodies. So this is very interesting to have somebody with this kind of diversity because what he's done is a very historic discovery. Henry Volokhonsky was born on March 19th, 1936 in Leningrad, and here's the key, he graduated from the Chemical Pharmaceutical Institute. That means you're studying chemistry and you're studying biology, which is the key that he had to have in place to unlock the mysteries of biological geometry. In the late 1950s, he began to write poems, songs, and plays, which were published in Samizdat, which is a major Russian publication everybody knows. Only one of his works was published in the USSR, the Bike Centaur in the journal Aurora in 1972. Now, Samizdat might be an Israeli journal because he does end up moving to Israel, as we'll see here in a minute, because it did just say only one of his journals made it into the USSR. In 1973, the year I was born, he went to Israel after 12 years and then moved to Munich in Germany, where he worked on the radio as a news editor. Isn't that interesting? He was a radio show personality. And then he lived in the village of Rexingen near the town of Horb since 2004. If you actually go to this paper that's published on the codefund.com website of Dr. Mark White, the guy who cracked the code of the genetics of biological interactions between the 4 sides of the nucleotides being a tetrahedron, the 20 amino acids being a dodecahedron, he says that he was contacted by the daughter of Henry Volikovsky, who sent him this paper, and he only puts it up in Russian with no translation. I don't even know, he didn't mention the guy's name or anything. So I used Google Translate, and this is the title: The Assumed Arrangement of Amino Acids on the Faces of the Icosahedron. Whoa, wait a minute. Didn't you just say dodecahedron? Okay, this is important because the dodecahedron has 20 points. The icosahedron has 20 faces. So you could choose to do it either way. You could put the amino acids on the faces in the middle, or you could assign them to the points as Dr. Mark White did. So because this was discovered independently of Dr. Mark White, Volikovsky chose the icosahedron and stuck the amino acids in the middle of the faces, which is different, but the result is the same. Now here's another thing that's interesting. When you actually dig in there and read the paper, some of it is in English, and apparently he got published in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies, which is in English, in 1998, and it's basically the same title: The Disposition of Amino Acids on the Faces of an Icosahedron. So we know he was doing this at least back in 1998, but also some of his papers, at least what I could see from this one Russian paper, he was publishing all the way back since at least 1971, probably even earlier, because he was born in the 1930s. So this might not be a new discovery. It's probably in the fullness of time, and I'm hoping in the future that millions of people will watch this show. Maybe that's presumptuous, but I think we're tying a lot of things together here that nobody's ever done before, and I feel very honored to be able to give these scientists a voice and to restore Volikovsky to his place as the founding father of geometric genetics. So this is really cool because when we look at this paper, we have diagrams that are so similar to what we see from Dr. Mark White. So I'm not a Cyrillic expert, but what you see up there in the top right is Henri Volikovsky. So Henry is pronounced A-N-R-I, right, in Russian, but it means Henry. Anyway, I can't read all this, but I'm sure some of our viewers can. Now look at this. This is where it starts to get interesting. Exactly the same mapping of amino acid relationships across the face of a triangle, almost exactly what we saw from Dr. Mark White. So look at this carefully. Look at A, look at B, see what's going on, and then notice that by the time you get to E, that you have this interesting dividing of the triangle into ultimately what's going to be several quadrants there. And now look at this from Dr. Mark White. It's basically the same thing. You can see that by the time you get over to the tertiary area, you've got it divided again into 6 quadrants. And Volikovsky somehow, even before Mark White apparently discovered this on his own, Volikovsky had the same stuff. It's really amazing to see how similar these two look because they're both talking about the same thing. Volikovsky had some very scary looking diagrams where he breaks down the icosahedron into groups of 6 triangles. He's not showing you the whole thing. He's mapping out partial relationships across part of the geometry, showing how those different areas interact. And this all has to do with the basic laws of genetics. You know, there's not a test at the end of this episode. I'm not asking you to remember all this, but look down at the one on the bottom left where you can see there's a triangle with just a dot in the middle, and all of those genetic relationships between the amino acids, they all work so beautifully. And then here, this is the money shot. This is where Volikovsky is showing us exactly the same type of relationships that we saw with Dr. Mark White, except in his case, he's doing it with an icosahedron and not with the dodecahedron. But wait, there's more. As I was looking for this, as I was trying to find the original paper from the Journal of Transpersonal Studies that Volikovsky published in English, which unfortunately I don't think it's online because I did keyword searches, I couldn't find it. But then I found out that someone else was mapping amino acids across an icosahedron. And even better, he had equated it to the Mayan counting system. This is amazing. This man's name is Fernando Castro Chavez, and he published his paper thanks to a grant in a peer-reviewed journal in 2016. So here is Fernando Castro Chavez. He's a young guy, And his paper is based on the idea that the Mayans used a counting system based on 20 instead of 10, which is called vigesimal. Vig means 20. So here's the paper, and you can see that it was published in the Journal of Biology and Nature, which is a publication coming out of India. This is an international publication, of course, and it says here, anatomical mnemonics of the genetic code, a functional icosahedron, there it is, and the vigesimal, i.e. 20-based, system of the Maya to represent the 20 proteinogenic amino acids. Proteinogenic means that they generate proteins. The Mayan culture developed the vigesimal system, a numerical system that he believes is based on the number of their fingers and toes counted together. My objective is to equate the Mayan system and their numerical representation to the 20 amino acids according to their size. Now, what's interesting about this is that he doesn't really say the core argument that's underneath all this, which is an ancient aliens type of argument. How the heck were the ancient Mayans aware that we have 20 amino acids? Molecular biology hadn't gotten to that point back then. They're supposed to be savages, right? So how the heck would they know this? But what he does is he shows that the way they count to 20 is a precise match with the behaviors, the characteristics, the solubility, all of the various factors we've been looking at of the amino acids. And again, when I was actually looking at the idea, 20 amino acids, corners of the dodecahedron, geometric, and I was thinking to myself last night actually, well, yeah, the Maya must have come up with this. And then this morning, I found this paper and I had to throw it in. It's just so amazing to me. Additional anatomical tools for the mnemonics of the genetic code, meaning how does it look, and its amino acid groups are also presented, as well as a functional icosahedron to represent them. Anna Baleva suggested the use of the icosahedron to represent the 20 amino acids. Here's what I think is going on. I think Anna Baleva is the daughter of Henry Volokhonsky, and I think this is the same daughter who contacted Dr. Mark White and got that paper listed on Mark White's website. She probably remarried and she probably took on her husband's last name, so she's not Anna Volokhonsky, but it seems pretty darn likely that this is what happened. So Volokhonsky's work has finally found its way into Fernando Chavez's work. So here's Anna Baleva. This is a picture of her I found online. I checked it thoroughly. This does appear to be her. And interestingly enough, she's been doing some really cool stuff, writing this particular brochure for Greenpeace. And here again, in Fernando's paper, is a mapping of genetic relationships across the dodecahedron with the amino acids. And in a way, he's taken it beyond where Volokhonsky did, because he's got all these lines showing you how the interactions occur. And remember, this is what we saw in Volokhonsky's paper, so it's slightly different. Doesn't have all the lines on it, doesn't have the divisions of the triangles. So this is part of what Fernando is showing us here, in which he's got the Mayan counting system, and you have the fingers and toes, and how that corresponds to the way that they count. And he has a very ingenious way of showing these relationships mapping out with amino acids. It's way more complex and technical than we have time to get into. And I really didn't even have time to dig into it properly before throwing it into the chute, but I will in time. And I encourage you to do the same. If you are interested in biology and genetics, this is another area that you can follow up on for more information. So here what he's doing is he's showing how these Mayan glyphs and symbols, the counting system itself, maps out so nicely with the 20 amino acids and the way that they stop and they sequence and all that stuff. It's all in there. Very, very cool. And he also makes comparisons between the Mayan system and the I Ching. Now, the I Ching, of course, has 64 hexagrams, as they're called. And there are other scientists, including Terence McKenna, who I mentioned before, who have compared the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching to the 64 codons in DNA. And again, that's another really weird thing, because if you dig into the science of that, and maybe we will at some point later on, how did the ancient Chinese know about the 64 parts of our genetic code in the DNA? How did they get this into a system of divination? Why would the 64 parts of the genetic code, if you look at it that way, correspond to 64 different tendencies that you could have in terms of giving yourself an I Ching reading, right? Because the whole idea is that you throw the 3 coins, or sometimes it's about picking stalks of grain or whatever. But the idea is you use some kind of divination, some kind of system where you allow yourself to go into a trance, meditate, and then create a system pick out the right coins or throw the coins or whatever it is that you do. Or if you have an I Ching book, you can use bibliomancy, where you actually just concentrate and then you open up to the page that feels right. And that's what a lot of people do now with the I Ching. You open up to the page that feels right and you read it, and that's the message. So these 64 different hexagrams correspond to 64 different messages you could get, all of which are different but interconnected, and it strangely seems to be connected to the genetic code. So once again, this makes sense if you take into account the possibility of angelic or ET beings who are infusing their knowledge into ancient cultures like the Maya and like the ancient Chinese. So here again we see Fernando showing the amino acid relationships across the surface of the icosahedron, and he's got colors to represent the different ones, and it's a perfect match of how it all fits together. And he shows how if you make the protein glucagon or glucogen, that this is the path that it would take across the icosahedron to make that shape happen. And then when you wrap it all up, it looks like this: the folded representation of the functional amino acid icosahedron in its static start position without having read in any protein formations to it. So this is the last thing I want to share with you. He said it was not only possible to represent a correspondence between the codons and their amino acids by using the inner and outer part of both hands, but the amino acids were correlated to the 20-based vigesimal system of the Maya as well, and then each finger and toe are used to represent each amino acid. Representing the 20 amino acids within a regular functional icosahedron had one specific modification. The functional codons of start and stop are shared within the same cell while operating independently, such as in the on-off switch for a light still currently present in almost every home. So then the big question is, what are the implications of this? The implications of this are absolutely stunning, because what we're seeing now is 3 different published papers. We have Dr. Mark White, who's done a bunch of papers, we have Wilcock, and now we have Fernando, and they're all coming at this in different ways with different diagrams, and none of them have actually made the connection to the vibrational component of geometry. So the idea here is that we could be going through some kind of frequency change, because if life is made this way, if life is made out of geometric patterns, then what we saw is that if you up-level the frequency, the geometry changes in its structure. So that makes it possible that something could happen to us now, something related to the whole solar system getting brighter, hotter, and more magnetic, that changes the frequency of our DNA and could evolve the structure itself. So when we do the next episode, we're going to be getting into the idea of how DNA could actually be transformed by frequency. It is very, very amazing, and I don't want you to miss it. I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.